When my husband died, my 71-year-old father-in-law bathed me when I was paralyzed. The truth behind left everyone silent. The water was scalding against Arthur's weathered knuckles as he tested it that December morning, but I couldn't warn him because my voice had abandoned me along with my legs. Through our paper-thin bedroom walls, I heard Mrs. Stella Kowalski's voice on her kitchen phone, sharp with malicious excitement. "Sheriff Morrison, this is Stella Kowalski on Brennan Road. I need to report what I believe is elder abuse, or worse. That old man Arthur has been in there with that helpless girl for over an hour now. I can hear sounds, water running movement. It's not right." My heart stopped. Arthur was reaching for the washcloth, completely unaware that our neighbor was summoning the police to arrest him for crimes he wasn't committing. If they took him away, I would die alone in this bed, abandoned to the mercy of institutions that saw paralyzed widows as nothing more than case numbers to process. I tried to scream a warning, but only a strangled whimper escaped. Arthur looked up, his pale blue eyes filled with gentle concern, the same expression he'd shown every morning for 3 weeks since taking over my complete care. "Water? Too hot again?" he asked quietly, testing the temperature with his wrist, the way he'd learned to do perfectly by now. Outside, Mrs. Kowalski's voice grew more urgent. "I'm telling you, Sheriff, something perverted is happening over there. An old man bathing a young woman who can't defend herself. Mark my words, when you investigate, you'll find this goes far deeper than inappropriate care." This was December 15th, 1978. 6 months and 3 days after my husband Jack died. 3 months and 27 days after my legs stopped working from grief. And the morning that threatened to destroy the only person who still treated me like Eleanor Brennan instead of a burden to be managed. I'm Eleanor, and this is the true story of how a scandal that should have shattered our family instead revealed a love so profound and a secret so devastating that it left our entire town speechless and changed my understanding of what devotion truly means. But I need to start where it all began, not with my tragedy, but with a promise made in darkness 36 years earlier to a dying woman whose name no one dared speak aloud. Jack and I arrived in Millfield, Ohio on March 20th, 1976, with everything we owned packed into a borrowed pickup truck and dreams bigger than our combined bank account. Millfield was the kind of place where 3 generations of families lived within walking distance of each other, where everyone knew your business before you knew it yourself, and where strangers were politely tolerated until they proved their worth. The town centered around Route 33, with Beckman's General Store serving as unofficial headquarters for all local news and gossip. Morrison's Feed and Grain anchored one end of Main Street, while First Methodist Church dominated the other. Between them sat the post office, Miller's Pharmacy, and Henderson's Diner establishments that had served the same families for decades. Our new home was a yellow clapboard house that came with Jack's inheritance from his grandfather Ezra. 53 acres of Ohio farmland, a barn that needed extensive repairs, and a kitchen with plumbing that required both prayer and profanity to function properly. But Jack saw potential where I saw problems. "We'll make it beautiful room by room," he promised, his carpenter's hands already sketching improvements in the air. "Add a nursery upstairs, expand the porch, maybe even install indoor plumbing that works without divine intervention." Across our shared yard stood Arthur's farmhouse, a larger, more solid structure that had been the original Brennan homestead for 4 generations. Arthur himself was as permanent a fixture as the century-old oak trees surrounding his porch, tall, spare, weathered by 60 years of Ohio winters, with pale blue eyes that revealed nothing while cataloging everything. Arthur's daily routine never varied. Up at 5 a.m. to tend his Holstein cattle and Rhode Island red chickens. Solitary breakfast while reading yesterday's Columbus Dispatch. Morning farm chores until noon. Lunch alone with agricultural reports. Afternoon fieldwork until supper. Early bed with farming magazines and no conversation unless absolutely necessary. Our first family dinner was a study in awkward politeness. I'd spent all afternoon preparing pot roast with all the traditional fixings, desperate to make a good impression on my new father-in-law. Arthur ate methodically, cutting his meat into precise squares, chewing each bite exactly 12 times like he was processing fuel rather than enjoying a meal. "Arthur, Eleanor, and I were thinking about putting in a vegetable garden behind the barn," Jack said, trying to draw his father into conversation. "What's your opinion on the soil drainage over there?" Arthur continued chewing for 30 full seconds before responding. "Ground stays wet come spring rains. Better drainage closer to the house. More sun exposure, easier access for daily maintenance." He paused, then added with what passed for elaboration. "Grandfather Ezra grew prize-winning tomatoes right where your kitchen window faces. Soil's been resting 20 years now." That was 15 words more than Arthur would speak to me for the next several months. Jack filled the silences with stories about his carpentry work in Columbus, but Arthur just nodded and kept eating as if words were a precious commodity he couldn't afford to waste. The only time I glimpsed real emotion from Arthur was 3 months later when Jack casually mentioned his mother during our evening porch conversation. We were drinking sweet tea and watching sunset paint the cornfields gold and crimson, the kind of peaceful moment that made our move to Millfield feel like the right decision. "I wish Mom could have met Eleanor," Jack said, reaching over to squeeze my hand with fingers still dusty from a day of carpentry work. "She would have loved Eleanor's apple pie, especially that cinnamon crumble topping. Remember how Mom always said the secret to perfect pie was using real butter in the crust?" Arthur's reaction was immediate and startling. His entire body went rigid, as if Jack had slapped him without warning. He stood abruptly gathering our empty glasses with movements so sharp I heard ice cubes rattle against glass. "Getting dark," he muttered, his voice thick with something I couldn't identify. "Best get inside before the mosquitoes come out." He disappeared into his house without another word, leaving Jack and me sitting in uncomfortable silence. Later, as we walked back to our own house, Jack explained what little he knew about his mother's death. "Mary died when I was 18. He said, his voice troubled by memories he'd apparently tried not to examine too closely. "Some kind of mysterious illness that started gradually. First she complained about feeling tired all the time, then her legs got weak, and eventually she couldn't get out of bed at all." He kicked at a stone in our path, sending it skittering into the cornrows. "The whole thing lasted about 4 years, and it was hard. Really hard. Dad took care of her himself toward the end, wouldn't let anyone else help. After she died, he just shut down. Never remarried, never dated, never even mentioned her name, unless someone else brought it up first." Jack paused, looking back at his father's house, where a single light glowed in the kitchen window. "Sometimes I think part of him died with her, and he's just been going through the motions ever since." I filed that information away, understanding that grief could manifest in different ways. My own mother had thrown herself into church activities and social clubs after my father's heart attack, as if staying busy could somehow outrun the pain. Arthur had apparently chosen the opposite approach, building walls around his heart and maintaining them with the same methodical care he brought to farming. My introduction to Millfield's social dynamics came through my job at the public library, a brick building constructed in 1923 that housed approximately 4,000 books and served as unofficial community center for 3 rural townships. Mrs. Margaret Patterson, the head librarian, became my guide to local customs and unwritten rules. Margaret was 63, had lived in Millfield her entire life, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every family's history going back 5 generations. She could tell you who was related to whom just by looking at their jawline, and she understood the delicate balance required for outsiders to gain acceptance in a community where some neighbors had shared property lines for over a century. "People here are fundamentally good-hearted," she assured me during my first week, showing me the ancient card catalog system that hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. "But they're also protective of their own. They need time to decide whether you're going to be a positive addition to the community or just another outsider who'll cause problems and leave when things get difficult." She was right about the probationary period. The Methodist ladies were polite but reserved when I joined their Wednesday quilting circle, offering careful compliments on my stitching, while maintaining emotional distance. The clerks at Beckman's General Store were professional but formal, always adding "ma'am" to every interaction, as if reminding themselves I hadn't earned familiarity yet. But gradually, as seasons changed and I proved my commitment to community involvement, the barriers began dissolving. Mrs. Helen Henderson, who ran the Methodist Women's Auxiliary with military precision, was the first to extend genuine friendship. Helen was a woman of strong opinions and stronger actions, someone who approached charitable works with the same efficiency she brought to running her household. She'd lost her first husband in Korea and had raised 3 children alone before remarrying at 45. This background had given her both compassion for struggling families and impatience with people who wallowed in self-pity instead of taking action to improve their circumstances. "You've got good instincts and a strong work ethic," she told me after I'd spent a Saturday helping organize their Christmas bazaar. "That matters more than how long your family's been here. People can sense authenticity and they respect effort even when they're slow to show it." Mrs. Dorothy Pritchard presented a more complex case. She was a woman in her 50s whose severe exterior concealed deep wells of guilt and regret that I wouldn't fully understand until much later. Dorothy's mother had suffered a stroke 5 years earlier that left her partially paralyzed and requiring constant care. Dorothy had made the difficult decision to place her mother in a nursing home in Columbus rather than attempt home care, and she'd been wrestling with guilt ever since. This background explained Dorothy's particular intensity when she visited with her leather Bible, an endless supply of comforting verses. She wasn't just trying to help me, she was attempting to atone for what she viewed as her own failure to properly care for a helpless family member. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. She would read from Psalm 34, her voice carrying desperate conviction. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. You have to believe that, Eleanor. You have to trust that your suffering has meaning. Mrs. Stella Kowalski, who lived directly across from our house, represented the community's darker tendencies. Stella was a woman who found genuine pleasure in other people's misfortunes, someone who collected gossip the way other people collected recipes or quilting patterns. She had moved to Millfield after marrying Stan Kowalski 15 years earlier, but had never fully integrated into the community's social fabric. Instead, she'd positioned herself as a self-appointed moral guardian, always ready to point out when others fell short of her standards. Stella made a habit of timing her yard work to coincide with interesting developments in neighbors' lives. She could tell you exactly how long visitors stayed at any house on Brennan Road, what time lights went on and off, and whether anyone received unusual deliveries or phone calls. This surveillance wasn't born from concern for community welfare. It was entertainment for someone whose own life apparently lacked sufficient drama. By Christmas, 1977, I felt genuinely integrated into Millfield's social fabric. The Methodist ladies had accepted me into their inner circle. Jack's reputation as an honest craftsman was bringing him more work than he could handle, and we'd started discussing plans for the nursery we'd eventually need. Even Arthur had begun staying for Sunday dinners, though he still spoke mainly to Jack about weather patterns and crop yields. June 12, 1978, our third wedding anniversary dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect Ohio weather that made promises feel possible. Jack had taken the day off to drive me to Columbus for dinner at the hotel, where we'd spent our honeymoon, and I'd spent an hour choosing between the blue dress he loved and the green one that made me feel confident. I was standing in front of our bedroom mirror at 2:15 p.m., finally deciding on the blue dress, when the telephone started ringing downstairs with unusual urgency. Something about that sound made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread, as if my subconscious understood that some phone calls change everything, while my conscious mind was still focused on trivial decisions about clothing. Sheriff Robert Morrison's voice was steady, but strained when I answered. "Mrs. Brennan, this is about your husband Jack. There's been an accident on Highway 33 and I'm afraid he didn't make it." The details came in fragments that my mind struggled to process. A logging truck loaded with 40 tons of prime oak timber had lost its brakes coming down the long hill outside town. The driver had tried steering into the ditch to avoid oncoming traffic, but the massive load had shifted, causing the trailer to jackknife and spill logs across both lanes of highway. Jack's pickup had been rounding the curve at exactly the wrong moment, nowhere to go, no time to stop, no way to avoid tons of timber that would have become beautiful furniture in his skilled hands under different circumstances. The paramedics confirmed death was instantaneous. Sheriff Morrison said, his voice gentler now. "He wouldn't have suffered, Mrs. Brennan. That's some small comfort, I hope." I stood in our kitchen holding the dead phone for what felt like hours, staring at the anniversary card I'd propped against our sugar bowl that morning. Jack had written inside, "3 years down, forever to go? You make every sunrise worth seeing, beautiful girl." The words seemed to mock me now, promises shattered by mechanical failure and terrible timing. The funeral, 4 days later, packed First Methodist Church beyond its 200-person capacity. Jack had earned genuine respect in our community through honest work and fair dealing, and people stood along the walls and spilled into the vestibule to pay their respects. Arthur stood beside me throughout the service, his face carved from granite, while Reverend Matthews spoke about divine plans and eternal rest. When the first shovelful of Ohio soil hit Jack's mahogany casket, with a hollow final sound that seemed to echo across the cemetery, Arthur's hand settled briefly on my shoulder, the only gesture of comfort he offered during those terrible days. He was the finest son a man could ask for," Arthur said quietly as we walked away from the grave. "Built things to last, always finished what he started, treated everyone with respect. His memory will honor this family as long as any of us draw breath." Those words represented the most personal thing Arthur had ever said to me, and I treasured them during the weeks that followed, when grief settled over me like a physical weight that made breathing feel like conscious effort. For 6 weeks after Jack's funeral, I existed rather than lived, moving through our yellow house like a ghost haunting her own life. The familiar rooms that had once felt like sanctuary now echoed with Jack's absence, his coffee mug still sitting in the dish rack, his work clothes hanging in our closet, his tools arranged with precise care in the workshop where he'd spent countless happy hours creating beauty from raw lumber. The Methodist ladies rallied with their characteristic efficiency, organizing rotations of visits and meals designed to ensure I wouldn't be alone with grief for extended periods. But their well-meaning attention felt like additional weight rather than support, and each visit reminded me of how fundamentally my life had changed. Helen Henderson approached my care with the same military precision she brought to church auxiliary projects. She arrived every Tuesday and Friday at exactly noon, carrying casseroles in her late mother's serving dishes and firm opinions about my physical condition. "You need to eat properly, Eleanor," she insisted on July 3rd, spooning beef stew into bowls I had no intention of touching. "Jack wouldn't want you wasting away like this. He'd want you honoring his memory by taking care of yourself and eventually finding ways to contribute to the community again." Helen's approach was practical and well-intentioned, but it failed to account for the fact that I couldn't make my body cooperate with logic. Food tasted like sawdust sleep, brought nightmares more vivid than waking hours, and every room in our house whispered Jack's name in voices only I could hear. Dorothy Pritchard's visits were more emotionally intense but equally ineffective. She arrived every Wednesday afternoon carrying her worn leather Bible and a desperate need to find meaning in senseless tragedy. "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning," she read from Psalm 30 on July 19th, her voice trembling with conviction born from her own unresolved guilt. "The Lord will not cast off forever. But though he cause grief, yet will he have compassion according to the multitude of his mercies." What I didn't understand then was that Dorothy was trying to convince herself as much as me. Every verse she read aloud was an attempt to justify her own decision to place her mother in institutional care instead of providing home nursing herself. She was seeking absolution through scripture, while I was drowning in grief that no amount of biblical comfort could touch. By August, I'd lost 28 pounds and was surviving on perhaps 4 hours of sleep per night. Dr. Harrison Millfield's only physician started prescribing sleeping pills that left me groggy and disoriented, but didn't prevent the dreams where Jack came home from work as usual asking about dinner, as if death had been nothing more than a temporary business trip. The morning my legs stopped working was September 18th, 1978, exactly 3 months and 6 days after the accident. I'd been lying awake since 4 a.m., thinking about how Jack should have been getting ready for work, humming Sweet Caroline in the shower, the way he did when facing challenging carpentry projects. When I tried getting up at 6:30 a.m. to use the bathroom, my legs simply refused to respond. At first, I assumed they'd fallen asleep from lying motionless for too long, but the familiar tingling sensation never came. No amount of mental commanding could produce even minimal movement, and gradually the terrifying truth became undeniable. My body had decided to stop cooperating with my mind's instructions. I lay there for 3 hours, staring at my motionless limbs, beneath the wedding ring quilt my grandmother had sewn for us, trying to comprehend how grief could sever the pathways between thought and action. The terror was primal and overwhelming, the sensation of being imprisoned inside flesh that had become as unresponsive as stone. Dr. Harrison's examination revealed no physical explanation for my condition. After 3 days of comprehensive testing at County General Hospital, he delivered his diagnosis with the gentle precision of someone who'd seen similar cases but never grew comfortable discussing them. "It's called conversion disorder, Eleanor," he explained, sitting beside my hospital bed with the patience of a man who understood that medical terminology meant nothing to people trapped inside their own bodies. Sometimes when emotional trauma exceeds the mind's capacity for processing, the subconscious takes protective action by shutting down certain bodily functions. Your mind has essentially decided you've carried maximum emotional weight, so it's removing your ability to carry physical weight. "Will I walk again?" I asked, dreading his answer, but needing to know. Dr. Harrison was quiet for nearly a minute, his kind eyes troubled by a prognosis he couldn't predict with any certainty. "Honestly, I don't know. I've seen patients recover completely within weeks and others where the paralysis became permanent. The human mind is mysterious territory, especially when it comes to trauma response. We'll start physical therapy to prevent muscle deterioration and see if we can gradually convince your nervous system to reconnect." When the ambulance brought me home on September 24th, Arthur was waiting beside a wheelchair-accessible ramp he'd constructed during my 3-day hospitalization. He'd also arranged for hospital bed installation in our guest bedroom and had stocked our bathroom with medical supplies Medicare would partially cover. "We'll handle this together," Arthur said simply as paramedics transferred me from gurney to wheelchair, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing weather or cattle prices. But there was something else underneath the determination that suggested this wasn't just duty, but something approaching sacred obligation. The practical challenges of my care quickly overwhelmed everyone except Arthur. My sister Jennifer drove down from Cleveland every weekend, but her own family obligations made extended assistance impossible. The Methodist ladies meant well, but their visits grew shorter and less frequent as autumn stretched toward winter. Helen Henderson's arthritis made lifting and positioning increasingly painful for her. Dorothy Pritchard's mother had been diagnosed with advancing dementia, requiring Dorothy's constant attention, and finally resolving her guilt about institutional care by making home nursing impossible. Even Mrs. Patterson from the library, who'd been among my strongest supporters, found her volunteer hours stretched thin by multiple community crises. That left Arthur as my primary caregiver by process of elimination rather than choice. But as days turned to weeks, I began noticing something remarkable about the way he approached my care. There was no embarrassment in his manner, no discomfort with intimate necessities, no impatience with the repetitive nature of daily assistance. He worked with methodical precision, but also with something I hadn't expected: genuine tenderness. Arthur's daily routine adapted seamlessly to include my needs. He would rise at his usual 5 a.m. complete morning farm chores, then cross the yard to help me with breakfast and morning care. After lunch, he'd return for afternoon medications and positioning changes. Evening brought dinner preparation assistance with personal hygiene and careful positioning for overnight comfort. Most surprisingly, Arthur would hum quietly while working old hymns like Amazing Grace and How Great Thou Art that transformed necessary tasks into something approaching ritual. His touch was clinical but respectful, his movements careful and considerate of my dignity, even when I felt I had none left. Millfield's tight-knit community structure meant that Arthur's daily visits to my bedside couldn't go unnoticed for long. Stella Kowalski, whose house directly faced ours across Brennan Road, made herself the unofficial monitor of our unusual arrangement. Stella's surveillance began innocently enough, hanging laundry with exaggerated care. Whenever Arthur's truck was parked in our driveway longer than usual, checking her mailbox multiple times during his visits, finding reasons to work in her front garden when he arrived for evening care sessions. But as weeks passed, Stella's observations became more pointed and her conclusions more sinister. She began timing Arthur's visits with a kitchen clock, noting when lights stayed on late in my bedroom, cataloging the frequency of his trips to Miller's pharmacy for my medications. The first direct evidence of gossip came on December 10th, when I overheard Stella talking to Ruth Hodgins from First National Bank. Their voices carried clearly through my bedroom window as they stood beside Stella's mailbox, presumably discussing postal delivery, but actually dissecting my living situation. "I'm telling you, Ruth, that man spends hours over there every single day," Stella said, her tone suggesting moral outrage barely held in check. "Hours. And I've seen lights in that girl's bedroom until nearly midnight some nights. What could an old man possibly be doing with a paralyzed young woman for that length of time?" Ruth's response carried the false sympathy that small-town gossips perfect over years of practice. "Poor Eleanor probably doesn't have much choice in the matter, does she? But you're absolutely right, it looks terrible. Someone should speak to Reverend Matthews about appropriate arrangements for situations like this." Their conversation continued for another 10 minutes, each woman contributing increasingly creative speculation about Arthur's motivations and my helplessness. By the time they parted ways, they'd transformed necessary caregiving into potential exploitation, family devotion into suspected perversion. Similar conversations began occurring throughout Millfield as autumn stretched into winter. At Henderson's Diner, farmers lingered over coffee to discuss the situation at the Brennan place. At Beckman's General Store, shoppers whispered about inappropriate arrangements and what people must think. Even at First Methodist Church, concern for my welfare became indistinguishable from prurient interest in our private circumstances. The social pressure on Arthur intensified with each passing week. Linda Kowalski, Stella's daughter-in-law who worked at Beckman's, made him wait while she served other customers, her disapproval radiating from every gesture. The pharmacist's wife found urgent business elsewhere when Arthur came to collect my prescriptions. Even Dr. Harrison seemed increasingly uncomfortable during monthly checkups, asking careful questions about my living situation and whether I felt appropriately cared for. But Arthur seemed genuinely oblivious to the gossip, or at least determined not to let community judgment affect his behavior. He maintained his routine with the same reliability he'd shown for 40 years of farming, never rushing his care or showing signs of self-consciousness about our unconventional arrangement. "People need something to occupy their minds during winter months," he said on December 18th, when I tried apologizing for the damage his reputation was suffering. "Better they worry about us than find more harmful ways to spend their time." The situation that would determine my future arrived on March 15, 1979, in the person of my Aunt Carol, who descended on Millfield from Cincinnati like an avenging angel armed with moral outrage and firm opinions about proper behavior for widows. Carol was my mother's youngest sister, a retired high school principal who'd spent 35 years molding teenage behavior according to strict standards of appropriate conduct. She was a formidable woman, steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun, penetrating eyes that could reduce unruly students to tears, and an unwavering conviction that she could solve any problem through proper planning and decisive action. Carol had driven down after receiving what she called deeply disturbing reports from Methodist friends in Cincinnati who'd heard about my situation through the extensive church network connecting small Ohio towns. These reports painted Arthur as either a predator exploiting my helplessness or a well-meaning but inappropriate caregiver whose methods were causing community scandal. Eleanor Marie Brennan. She announced, marching into my bedroom at 10:30 a.m. with her coat still buttoned and her purse clutched like a weapon. I simply cannot believe what I'm hearing about this household and the completely inappropriate situation you've allowed to develop here. Arthur was helping with morning exercises when she arrived, guiding my legs through range of motion stretches that Janet Coleman, my physical therapist, had taught him to prevent muscle atrophy. Carol's expression when she saw him leaning over my bed, his weathered hands on my legs, was pure horror, mixed with righteous indignation. "Step away from her immediately!" Carol commanded, her voice sharp enough to shatter glass and carrying all the authority she'd once wielded over classrooms full of unruly teenagers. "What you're doing is inappropriate, unseemly, and quite possibly criminal. I've already contacted Sunny Meadows Nursing Home in Columbus. They have a bed available Monday morning." Arthur straightened slowly, his movements controlled, as he turned to face this new threat to our carefully constructed routine. His expression remained neutral, but I could see tension gathering in his shoulders like storm clouds building on a distant horizon. "Ma'am, we haven't been properly introduced," he said quietly, his voice polite but carrying an undertone of steel I'd never heard before. "I'm Arthur Brennan, Eleanor's father-in-law." "I know exactly who you are." Carol snapped, her voice rising with each word as moral fury found its voice. "And I know what you've been doing to this poor, helpless girl, taking advantage of her vulnerability, using her dependency for your own perverted purposes. The entire community is talking about it, and I'm frankly appalled that no one has intervened to stop this disgusting situation." What Carol didn't realize was that her voice was carrying clearly through our thin walls to Stella Kowalski's kitchen, where Stella was undoubtedly taking notes for future gossip sessions. More immediately dangerous, I could hear Stella on her telephone, her voice urgent with excitement. "Sheriff Morrison, this is Stella Kowalski on Brennan Road. There's some kind of domestic disturbance happening at the Brennan house right now, shouting what sounds like a confrontation. I think you'd better get over here before someone gets hurt." "Arthur," I whispered urgently, "you need to leave. The neighbors are calling the police. If they find you here during this argument..." But Arthur just stood straighter, his jaw set with determination I'd never seen before. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor. Not until the complete truth is told." Carol was pulling out her cell phone, her face flushed with righteous anger. "I'm calling the authorities myself if you don't step away from that bed immediately. What you're doing is elder abuse, and I won't stand for it another moment." "Go ahead and call them," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "But first, you're going to hear something that'll change your understanding of everything you think you know about this situation." That's when Arthur began revealing secrets he'd carried alone for 36 years. Not just about Mary's illness and death, but about the promise that had shaped every decision he'd made since losing her. 36 years ago?" Arthur began, his voice steady, despite the chaos surrounding us. "My wife Mary developed the exact same condition Eleanor has now. The doctors called it hysteria, then claimed her mind had broken from the strain of losing 2 babies within 14 months of each other." Carol had gone completely still, her phone forgotten in her hand, as she began to understand this wasn't going to be the simple confrontation she'd expected. One day, Mary was normal, cooking breakfast, tending her garden, planning improvements to this house, and the next morning, she couldn't move her legs, couldn't get out of bed, couldn't take care of herself in the most basic ways. Arthur's voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm in telling a story he'd never shared with anyone. "We tried everything medical science could offer. Specialists from Columbus, experimental treatments that cost more money than we had, therapies that promised miraculous cures they couldn't deliver. Nothing worked. Mary was trapped in her own body, and watching her suffer was killing me piece by piece. He turned from the window where he'd been staring at fields where winter wheat was just beginning to show green shoots through melting snow. When he faced us again, I saw tears in his eyes, the first real emotion I'd ever witnessed from this stoic man. The church ladies came to help exactly like they do now. Well-meaning neighbor women who treated Mary like she was already dead, discussing her condition over her head, as if she couldn't hear them handling her like furniture that needed moving from one position to another. Arthur's voice roughened with remembered pain and helpless rage. Mary begged me to stop letting them come. Said she'd rather die than have strangers seeing her naked touching her body without permission, stealing the last scraps of dignity she had left. She cried every night after their visits, not from physical pain, but from the humiliation of being reduced to a problem that needed managing instead of a person who deserved love. "What did you do?" Carol asked quietly, her anger replaced by growing uncertainty and something that might have been shame. Arthur's composure cracked as decades of buried grief finally found expression. I took over her care completely, fed her, bathed her, dressed her, helped with every intimate necessity that couldn't be avoided, spent hours sitting with her reading books aloud, talking about anything that might make her feel human instead of burdensome. His voice strengthened with conviction born from experience. People talked then too exactly like they're talking now. Said it wasn't proper for a husband to provide intimate care when trained nurses were available. But Mary felt safe with me. Felt loved instead of pitied, cared for instead of processed through a system that saw her as a case to manage rather than a woman who deserved respect. "What happened to her?" Carol whispered, and I could hear in her voice that she was beginning to understand the magnitude of pain Arthur had carried alone for more than 3 decades. Arthur covered his face with his hands as grief that had never fully healed overwhelmed his careful control. "She killed herself," he said, the words tumbling out like stones from a broken dam. "November 3rd, 1943. Saved her pain medication for 3 weeks and took it all at once while I was doing evening chores. Left me a letter saying she couldn't stand being a burden anymore, couldn't bear the thought of living like an invalid for whatever years remained to her." The silence that followed was absolute pressing down on all of us, with the weight of truth, too devastating to deny or dismiss. Through the walls, I could hear that even Stella Kowalski had stopped talking, perhaps sensing that something momentous was happening in the house she'd been watching so intently. But Arthur wasn't finished. His voice dropped to barely audible as he revealed the secret that had shaped every day of his life since Mary's death. "That's not the complete story," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "Mary's letter wasn't just a suicide note explaining why she wanted to die. She made me promise something that would matter more than my grief, more than my guilt, more than whatever people might think or say." Arthur walked to his coat and pulled out a small wooden box I'd never seen before. With trembling hands, he opened it and withdrew a yellowed envelope that looked like it might crumble at his touch. "She wrote this 2 weeks before she died, when she was still strong enough to hold a pen steady," Arthur said quietly. "I've carried it every day for 36 years, waiting for the chance to honor her final request." With infinite care, he unfolded a single sheet of paper, covered in faded feminine handwriting. His voice broke as he read aloud words that had been written in desperation, but carried the weight of prophecy. "My dearest Arthur, if you're reading this, then I've found the courage to end my suffering in the only way that seemed possible. Please don't blame yourself for my choice. You gave me more love and dignity during these terrible years than any woman could have hoped for. But I need you to promise me something that will give meaning to my death. If God ever blesses our family with another woman who faces what I've faced, you must care for her the way you've cared for me. You must not let her suffer the loneliness and humiliation that would destroy her spirit. You must use your gentle hands to preserve her dignity. See her as a person worthy of love instead of a burden to be managed. Give her what you've given me, proof that she matters, that she's worth someone's tenderness, that being helpless doesn't make her worthless. Promise me you'll remember that love sometimes means doing difficult things with grace, that family means protecting each other's dignity, even when the world doesn't understand. Promise me my death won't be meaningless. Let it become the foundation for someone else's salvation. This is my final gift to you and to any woman who might need what only you can provide. All my love forever, Mary. Arthur refolded the letter with infinite care, his hands shaking with emotion he'd suppressed for more than 3 decades. Jack was my son, which makes Eleanor my daughter, by marriage and by choice. I gave Mary my sacred word, and I'll keep it until I die, or Eleanor no longer needs my help. He looked directly at Carol with eyes blazing with conviction, tested by decades of pain and sacrifice. If that makes me inappropriate in your judgment, I'll accept that consequence, but I won't abandon Eleanor to some institution where she'll become just another case number managed by people who don't know her heart or care about her dignity. Carol stood frozen for a moment, then slowly walked to the window where Sheriff Morrison's patrol car was pulling into our driveway. Instead of waving him in, she went outside and had a brief conversation through his car window. I watched her gesture toward the house, shake her head firmly, then send him away with what appeared to be an apology for the false alarm. When she returned, tears were streaming down her face. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed grief and newfound respect. "I owe you the deepest apology any human being has ever owed another. I came here believing I was rescuing Eleanor from an inappropriate situation, and instead, I nearly destroyed something sacred and necessary." But Arthur's revelations weren't complete. As Carol sat heavily in the chair beside my bed, her righteous anger replaced by shame and growing understanding, Arthur pulled another document from his wooden box, one that would explain even more about the courage required for his devotion to Mary's memory. "There's something else about Mary's death that I've never told anyone," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of secrets that had grown heavier with each passing year. "Something I was afraid to reveal because I thought it would make people think even worse of our situation." He unfolded a second piece of paper, this one, official looking, with letterhead from the Franklin County Sheriff's Department. After Mary died, Sheriff Patterson Morrison's predecessor opened a homicide investigation. Neighbors had reported what they called suspicious circumstances about Mary's death. Carol gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the implications became clear. They said it was unnatural for a husband to provide such intimate care for his wife. Arthur continued, his voice growing stronger as long-buried anger finally found expression. "They claimed no decent man would bathe his own wife, dress her, handle her most personal needs when trained nurses were available. They suggested I might have killed Mary to end what they assumed must have been an unbearable burden." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by distant sounds of normal life continuing outside our walls, birds singing, cars passing the ordinary world, carrying on while extraordinary truths were being revealed in our small bedroom. The investigation lasted 8 months. Arthur said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd lived with suspicion and whispered accusations for decades. They questioned everyone, doctors, neighbors, church members. They examined Mary's body, analyzed her medications, scrutinized every detail of her care and our relationship. They interviewed me 17 times, each session lasting hours, asking the same questions over and over, as if they could trap me in lies about loving my wife. He refolded the document with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. Only Mary's detailed suicide letter and testimony from Dr. Patterson's father, who was our family physician, finally convinced them I was innocent. But the damage was done. For 36 years, I've lived with people wondering if I killed my wife rather than continue caring for her. Arthur looked directly at Carol, then at me, his pale blue eyes blazing with conviction that had been tested by more than 3 decades of doubt and judgment. When Eleanor got sick, I knew the same whispers would start again. People would wonder about my motivations, question my methods, suggest inappropriate arrangements. But I also knew I couldn't break my promise. To Mary couldn't let Eleanor suffer the way Mary suffered, regardless of what people thought or said or suspected. The complete truth of Arthur's sacrifice finally became clear. He hadn't just risked his reputation to care for me. He'd risked being investigated for murder again, endured the possibility of criminal charges and community suspicion, all to honor a promise made to his dying wife 36 years earlier. Carol's transformation from outraged relative to ashamed ally was immediate and complete. She called Sunny Meadows that afternoon to cancel arrangements she'd made without consulting anyone, explaining to the administrator that family circumstances had changed and institutional care was no longer necessary. She spent the next 3 days with us, watching Arthur work with quiet efficiency and genuine tenderness, seeing for herself the respect and careful attention he brought to every aspect of my daily needs. When she left for Cincinnati, she made a point of stopping at several businesses in town to speak with people who'd been spreading rumors about our living arrangement. That man is a saint, she told Margaret Patterson at the post office, speaking loudly enough for other customers to hear and remember. If more people had his integrity and commitment to family, this world would be infinitely better. Anyone who thinks otherwise doesn't understand the first thing about real love and devotion. The change in community attitude wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable over the following weeks. The whispers gradually died down, replaced by grudging acknowledgement that perhaps they'd misjudged the situation. Reverend Matthews made a sermon the following Sunday about not bearing false witness against neighbors, and Dr. Harrison started asking how Arthur was holding up under the strain instead of questioning the appropriateness of my care. More importantly, the revelation of Mary's complete story had transformed something fundamental between Arthur and me. The careful distance he'd maintained for months began dissolving, replaced by genuine warmth and affection that made our daily routine feel like family intimacy rather than medical necessity. We started having real conversations during morning care, sharing memories of Jack's childhood, Arthur's experiences, building the farm from nothing, my own dreams and fears about the future. Arthur told me about Mary's love for gardening, her skill at preserving vegetables and fruits that sustained them through long winters, her dreams of traveling to places she'd only read about in library books. "She would have liked you tremendously," Arthur said one morning as he helped with exercises Dr. Harrison had recommended. "Would have appreciated your spirit, your determination not to give up, despite everything that's happened to you." "Do you think I'll walk again?" I asked, voicing the question that haunted my thoughts during sleepless nights. Arthur was moving my legs through their range of motion, his touch gentle but firm as he worked to prevent muscle atrophy and joint stiffness. "Don't know for certain," he said honestly, meeting my eyes with the directness I'd come to value above false comfort. "But I know you're stronger than you think you are. Mary gave up because she couldn't see past her condition to the life that was still possible. You're not Mary Eleanor. You're fighting back." Arthur proved prophetic about my resilience. Through spring and summer of 1979, sensation began returning to my legs first, as occasional tingles that made me cry with relief, then as genuine feeling, finally as actual movement that started with wiggling my toes and gradually progressed to bending my knees. Arthur celebrated each small victory as if it were a miracle, encouraging me through the painful process of relearning how to use muscles that had been dormant for months. He built parallel bars in our living room where I could practice standing and taking hesitant steps, his hands always ready to catch me if I fell, but never interfering unless absolutely necessary. The physical therapy was grueling and often frustrating. Some days my legs responded to mental commands, while others brought setbacks that made progress feel impossible. But Arthur's patient encouragement never wavered, and gradually I began to believe that recovery might actually be possible. Dr. Harrison monitored my progress with amazement that bordered on professional excitement. "I've never seen such consistent improvement in a conversion disorder case," he told me during one of my monthly appointments. "Whatever you and Arthur are doing, it's working better than any treatment I could have prescribed." By Christmas 1979, I was walking with a cane, moving carefully but independently around our house for the first time in over a year. By spring 1980, I was strong enough to help Arthur with light farm chores, feeding chickens, and gathering eggs, tasks that felt like magnificent achievements after months of complete helplessness. The recovery wasn't complete. I still had days when my legs felt weak or unsteady, times when stress or exhaustion would cause temporary setbacks that reminded me how fragile my progress really was. But I was alive and mobile and grateful in ways I'd never imagined possible before experiencing the complete loss of those basic abilities. Arthur's health began declining gradually around 1982. Nothing dramatic at first, just the natural slowing that comes with advancing age and a lifetime of physical labor. But I noticed changes. He moved more carefully than before, rested more often during heavy work, needed help with tasks that had never challenged him in all the years I'd known him. By 1985, our roles had reversed completely. I was the one bringing meals to his bedside when morning chores became too difficult for him to manage alone, helping him with personal care. When arthritis made simple tasks painful, sitting beside his bed in the evenings, reading newspapers and farm reports while he dozed fitfully. Funny how things work out," he said one evening as I helped him into his nightclothes, his voice weak but carrying a note of satisfaction that suggested he'd found peace with the way his life had unfolded. "Mary always said everything happens for reasons we can't always see at the time. Maybe caring for you prepared me for needing care myself." Arthur died peacefully on August 15, 1986, in the same bedroom where he'd nursed Mary through her final years and later provided my care during the darkest period of my life. He held my hand as he slipped away from pain that had been gradually consuming his body for months. His last words, practical instructions about cattle feeding schedules and field maintenance that reflected a lifetime spent caring for things that depended on him. After Arthur's funeral, I found additional documents hidden throughout his house: medical records, correspondence with doctors, and most revelatory of all, complete police files from Mary's death investigation that Arthur had kept for 43 years. The files revealed details Arthur had never shared, not even during his emotional confession to Carol. The investigation had been far more extensive than he'd indicated, involving interviews with over 30 community members, medical examinations of Mary's body that bordered on desecration, and psychological evaluations of Arthur that questioned his mental stability and sexual motivations. One particular document made my blood run cold: a psychological evaluation dated January 15, 1944, that concluded, "Subject Arthur Brennan presents with abnormal attachment to deceased wife's physical care. His insistence on providing intimate nursing suggests possible sexual deviance or psychological dysfunction. Recommend continued monitoring for signs of similar behavior with other vulnerable individuals." Arthur had lived with that assessment in his permanent record for 43 years. Every time he'd helped me with bathing or personal care, he'd risked triggering renewed investigation based on a decades-old psychological profile that painted love as perversion and devotion as mental illness. But the most heartbreaking discovery was Mary's original diary, hidden behind a false panel in Arthur's bedroom closet. Her entries chronicled not just her physical decline, but her growing awareness of the suspicion Arthur was facing because of his care for her. From Mary's diary, October 15, 1943. "Arthur doesn't know I heard Mrs. Patterson talking to Sheriff Patterson yesterday. She said it isn't natural for a man to be so involved in his wife's intimate needs that decent husbands would hire nurses or send their wives to proper facilities. She suggested Arthur might be taking advantage of my helplessness for his own perverted purposes. The thought that my condition has made people suspect Arthur of such horrible things is unbearable. Maybe if I weren't here, he could live without being whispered about and judged," Arthur had never told me that Mary's suicide was motivated partly by her desire to protect him from community suspicion. She'd killed herself not just from her own suffering, but to save Arthur from continued judgment about the care he provided out of pure love. Understanding the complete truth about Arthur's sacrifice transformed my own sense of purpose. I kept our farm, but converted part of it into Mary's house, a respite care facility for people recovering from severe illness or injury who needed intensive support while maintaining family connections. The program I developed focuses on training family caregivers in the kind of respectful, loving assistance that Arthur had pioneered decades ahead of his time. We teach that intimate caregiving doesn't diminish dignity but can actually enhance it when provided with proper respect and genuine affection. Over 37 years, Mary's House has served thousands of patients and trained hundreds of family caregivers across 3 counties. We've documented remarkable success rates in both physical recovery and emotional healing, proving Arthur's instinctive understanding that love often provides better medicine than professional detachment. One case particularly illustrates our impact. Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old teacher who became paralyzed in a car accident, was told by specialists that institutional care was her only option because her elderly parents couldn't handle her needs. After training at Mary's House, her parents provided home care that resulted in 90% mobility recovery within 18 months. "You taught us that caring for Sarah wasn't a burden, it was a privilege," her father told me during her graduation ceremony. "We learned that dignity isn't something you lose when you need help. It's something you preserve through the quality of help you receive." The Millfield community eventually embraced Mary's House with pride that bordered on possessiveness. People who'd once whispered about scandal became our strongest supporters, volunteers, and advocates. Mrs. Patterson worked with us for 15 years before her own health declined, never failing to mention Arthur's pioneering example when training new caregivers. "I was wrong about Arthur Brennan in every way possible," she announced during our 20th anniversary celebration. "I let fear and ignorance blind me to something beautiful and necessary." Arthur understood that caring for vulnerable people isn't just obligation, it's honor, privilege, sacred responsibility that transforms both caregiver and patient. I'm 74 now, still living in the yellow house where Jack and I began our marriage, where Arthur taught me that love sometimes requires extraordinary courage and unwavering commitment to another person's dignity. I never remarried or had the children Jack and I planned, but my life has been full of purpose and connection in ways I never expected. Every morning when I test water temperature in our therapy bathroom twice, exactly as Arthur taught me, I think about Mary's courage in expressing her needs, Arthur's strength in meeting them despite social pressure, and the extraordinary power of human connection to transform necessity into grace. The truth that left our community speechless wasn't scandalous or shameful. It was recognition that love takes countless forms, that dignity can be preserved even in extreme vulnerability, and that sometimes the greatest acts of devotion happen not in romantic gestures, but in daily choices to care for another person's suffering with the same tenderness we'd want for ourselves. Arthur Brennan saved my life not just physically, but spiritually by proving that even in our darkest moments we remain worthy of love, respect, and care that sees beyond helplessness to the person still living inside. His legacy continues in every family we train, every patient we serve, every moment when dignity triumphs over circumstance through the simple application of love made practical. People still ask about those months when Arthur cared for me, whether I ever felt uncomfortable about our unconventional arrangement. The truth is, I felt many emotions during that period: grief for Jack, fear about my future, frustration with my helpless body, uncertainty about recovery. But shame was never one of them, not once Arthur revealed the depth of love that motivated his actions. How could I be ashamed of being cared for by someone who saw me as worthy of the same devotion he'd shown his beloved wife? How could I feel diminished by assistance provided with such obvious respect for my humanity? Arthur taught me that the deepest love isn't always romantic or passionate or dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple and profound as testing water temperature twice to ensure comfort, as enduring as promises, kept across decades of grief and judgment, as transformative as the recognition that we all need care sometimes, and we all have the capacity to provide it with grace when called upon to serve. In the end, Arthur's story wasn't about scandal or inappropriate behavior or community judgment. It was about a man who understood that love means keeping your word even when it costs everything, that family means protecting each other's dignity, regardless of what others think, and that sometimes the most sacred acts look ordinary to people who don't understand what they're witnessing. The water was always exactly the right temperature, because Arthur had learned through decades of practice that caring for someone you love means paying attention to details that might seem insignificant to others, but make all the difference to the person receiving care. That's a lesson I've carried forward in every aspect of my work at Mary's House, and it's the legacy I hope to leave for future generations who may face similar challenges. Love is patient, love is kind, and sometimes love looks like an old man with gentle hands preserving a young woman's dignity during the darkest period of her life. That's not a scandal, it's a miracle.